Hi, this is Paul George tuning in. They tell me I'm live, so I presume I am. I just wanted to wait for a few seconds because it's just about 3 o'clock and I don't want to catch anybody who's trying to tune us in now and might miss a little bit of this. Looking forward, though, to joining you again today as we have a few weeks ago past and talk some more about the very, very rich history of Miami and the area in general. Okay? So I'm going to hold on for a second, put my glasses back on, and look at my phone. Oh, great. Okay, so we have Vanessa watching. That means everything's good. She is my go-to IT guru, and she makes sure everything's okay. So let's just hold on a second, and we'll get with it. We do have a remarkable change today. I'm speaking from a different room, the room on the second floor. Hey, Stuart. The room on the second floor, hey Casey, across from where I was before. This room has a little more decor to it, so I felt like maybe we should come back to this room. This is where Paul Jr. is going to be studying for his law boards for July. He's taking his law boards at that time, either in Tampa or Orlando. It's a real quiet room. In fact, when I was a boy, this was my bedroom. That's how far back this place goes. But I'm delighted to be back with you, and I'm just so happy that HistoryMiami has afforded me, as well as everybody watching, the opportunity to share in some history during these very unusual times we're living in. I wanted to talk, first of all, though, about the passing of a giant in Miami history, and that's Arva Parks. I learned last night around 7 p.m. that she had passed. I'd earlier sent her an email just asking her how she was doing. Didn't hear from her. The email was sent around noontime or so. She always got back to me, quickly, so I didn't think anything of it, and then I got the word that she had passed. And I wanted to say a couple words, if I could, about her, because in many ways she was a trailblazer in the study of Miami history, but also a trailblazer in terms of community involvement and the effort by one person, although she worked with many people with a lot of different projects, to make this a better place. She was a Miami native. She had a master's in history at the University of Miami. She was a diligent researcher, a superb stylist when it came to writing, was one of the very first to use what historians like to call primary source documents. It's kind of a highfalutin term, but she did some research in the National Archives. She went to diaries. She interviewed members of families she was writing on, just anything she could find, and the more abstruse the document, the better for her. So she really set, I think, a tremendous course for a lot of us who have worked in Miami history over the last 40 or 50 years. I met her about 45 years ago, and I was wrapping up my graduate studies at Florida State. And she assisted me all along the way from that point forward. Wrote with her, wrote for her, I wrote at her guidance, things of that nature. Wrote at her inspiration. She was also very involved in historic preservation and has a lot of victories in that respect. Was one of the many people instrumental in saving the Biltmore, the Sears Tower, among other places. She headed the City of Miami's Planning and Zoning Board, which is a very important board. This city, of course, has undergone development in the last 20 years, almost unlike any other city in the United States. And she was in the forefront of trying to protect what we have, but also to build intelligently. Involved in a lot of women's movement issues, was the first woman head of the Board of Trustees of HistoryMiami, which, of course, I'm a part of proudly. Was the founder in many ways of the Coral Gables Museum, the History Museum. In fact, I'm going to leave with an anecdote about that, and then we'll move into our talk on the Rhodes neighborhood today. I was watching the Super Bowl with some friends about, 7 or 8 years ago, and having a great time. And I get this call on my cell phone, and it's Arva. It's the middle of the Super Bowl. She says, I just want to ask you think it's prudent for me to become temporary head of this Coral Gables Museum? They need help. They're just getting underway. It's in the old fire and police department building on Coral Gables. And I said, hey, I think it's a great idea. But I said, you know something? It's a Super Bowl. Can we talk about this later? And she said, of course, of course. And she went on to really kind of birth that museum. So those are just some of the many, many, many things I remember about her, and we'll be sharing things about her, I'm sure, over the course of the next many weeks or so. But I wanted to talk today about the Rhodes, and it's a good segue from the wonderful Arva Parks of the Rhodes neighborhood, because she lived right on the edge of it for the better part of 30 years, in the late 1980s until recent years, when she moved over to the Shenandoah neighborhood just a few blocks from me. The Roads is a very interesting neighborhood. I'm going to put my glasses on because I've written some notes about this. It's also one of Miami's best kept secrets, and one of the city's most beguiling neighborhoods. In fact, my wife and I take walks through it every night, and it's helped me maintain my sanity during these 8.5 weeks of being sequestered, that's for sure. The Roads is so named, I guess, because in the mind of Mary Brickell, whose family owned all the property initially, she wanted wide roads. In fact, she even wanted them on diagonals. So the Roads really goes against the overall or mainstream grid system of the city of Miami, because many of the roads are on 45-degree angles. Probably the craziest of all of them is Carl Way, aka 22nd Street, 3rd Avenue, 13th Street. Try finding somebody who lives on 9th Avenue and 27th Road. Because of its variance from the grid system, it makes places hard to find. Now, I've come in contact with the Roads as a little boy. I went to St. Peter and Paul's School, which I loved. And St. Peter and Paul is right on the northern edge of the Roads. 26th Road, 12th Avenue, 27th Road, bifurcate the properties that represent St. Peter and Paul. So I knew it early on and always aspired to be part of it. The well-to-do kids in our school lived in the Roads, and the rest of us lived elsewhere, Shenandoah, Riverside, Conch Hill, what have you. And so the Roads has always been something that was very much in my psyche. Back in 2001, the Miami Roads Neighborhood Association, a very active association at that time, asked me to, with a lot of help, to conduct a survey, historic survey of the Roads preparatory to maybe getting it designated as an historic neighborhood. And so I hired a bunch of students from Miami-Dade College, where I was teaching at the time, but also a couple people from HistoryMiami, the education department, to help with the survey. We spent about a year, and we were able to use online stuff, which was way over my head at the time. For the most part, it still is. And we're able to write up the stories as best we could of 1,400 structures comprising an area. And these are the roads I'm going to define now, from South Miami Avenue north to 13th Street, in some places 11th Street, in other places 12th Street, all the way over to and beyond Southwest 12th Avenue. Now, I say beyond that because the Brickell Estates, the third major subdivision of the Roads, actually extends in a couple of blocks to Southwest 13th Avenue. In fact, at Mrs. Arva Parks' house by just 2 blocks. She's right on the western edge then of the Roads itself. And in the south, it goes all the way down to South Miami Avenue. So you've got a large neighborhood comprised of 3 subdivisions. Now, if you want to go back in time, the property that comprised the Roads, again, 15th Road to 12th Avenue, South Miami Avenue, irregularly north of 13th, 12th, and 11th Streets, you'd have to go back to 2 large Spanish land grants that were distributed during what we call the Second Spanish period in Florida history, 1783 to 1821. And one of those was the Rebecca Egan/Hagen land grant that would comprise a smaller portion of the Roads. The larger portion of the Roads was the Polly Lewis land grant. And both of these families were Bahamians, that tremendous Bahamian Miami connection of that era. And so the Brickell family, who would come down later, the Brickells didn't arrive in Miami until 1871, they purchased over time for a pittance these large 640-acre tracts of land awarded by the Spanish to these early settlers in the early 1800s that were then verified and approved after the United States purchased Florida in 1821. The Brickells purchased all of this. And they sat on the land. They really had vision when it came to this. Finally, the railroad entered Miami, as we all know, in 1896, April 13th. And the Brickells are ready now to, after 25 years of patience and land acquisition, to begin to exploit and take advantage of their great holdings. And so slowly but surely, they began to develop the area on both sides of today's Brickell Avenue. But they held off on developing the Roads and other areas that would be immediately east of there for a better time. Mary Brickell was very astute in real estate. She announced, and I'm just kind of looking at my notes now, she announced at the outset of the 1920s, actually just about a month or so before she passed, something called the Brickell Hammock neighborhood she was going to develop. And that would be a future millionaires row primarily along the east side of Brickell Avenue. That would be outside of the Roads neighborhood itself. And she wanted large lots, she wanted a wide road, she wanted a beautiful median, which was already there in part. for this exclusive neighborhood, and it became indeed a millionaire's row, all the way down to the northern edge of James Dering's Vizcaya at about 32nd Road. She was also beginning to think about the future Rhodes neighborhood. And again, wide roads are important to her. But she passed away in her mid-80s in January of 1922 and never really had a chance to develop that, although she did have plans, formal and informal, for that neighborhood. In 1922, members of her family sold off a tract of 180 acres between southeast, southwest 15th Road and southwest, southeast 23rd Road from South Miami Avenue down to irregularly 11th Street. It's a wide area of land to a man named C.J. Holloman, a wealthy realtor and businessman out of Pittsburgh. And Holloman had every intention of developing this, which he did, into wonderful homes with porticoches, open porches, masonry buildings, kept up a lot of the trees. Now, closer to the bay, that is closer to South Miami Avenue, you had the remnants of a subtropical hammock. In fact, Simpson Park was part of that original area that the Brickells had put on sale. And that became a city park, actually known as Jungle Park, before Holloman purchased the property in the early 1920s. But that's the way a lot of the land looked close to South Miami Avenue. As you move farther north, you ran into the Piney Woods. And the Piney Woods, of course, was an area of Dade County pine trees. And so Holloman hoped to build a movie studio in a portion of that. But at the same time, he began to build homes in 1922, and he hoped to have 50 ready for occupation by the end of 1922, beginning of 1923. So the first of the three subdivisions that comprises the Rhodes neighborhood, the Holloman Park subdivision, was well underway by 1922. He had laid out South Miami Avenue, he had graded some of the property, he had laid sidewalks down. Very, very interesting place, and that area is really a gorgeous area. Then a second subdivision came on the market in 1925 called the Brickell Hammock subdivision, stretching from 23rd Street west to, and this varies according to where you are, 26th and 27th Avenues, and then down south for a couple blocks to north for a couple blocks to 5th Avenue. This is very tricky stuff here. And the Brickell Hammock neighborhood would have these beautiful small Mediterranean-style homes. This was the boom in the mid-20s. The Mediterranean style was the dominant style at that time. They would also have medians in the center with trees. And that's just the way it has materialized over these last many decades. And then a third subdivision came on the market later in 1925 called the Brickell Estates subdivision. That's a subdivision that stretches from, again, depending on where we are in the roads, looking in an east-west direction, west as far as the west side up to 13th Avenue of the neighborhood. That's the Brickell Estates subdivision. Now, it goes as far north as 13th Street in some areas. And then it comes back up to about Southwest 5th Avenue. And again, these avenues and streets are all a little bit different from what we're used to in the rest of the grid that comprises the city of Miami. So you had the Brickell Estates. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of things noteworthy. When the Brickell Hammock subdivision was put on the market, they erected these large tents. And we have photographs, and they may be coming up on the screen. In fact, we have photographs of these primitive-looking moving machines, these earth-moving machines, clearing this Piney Woods area in preparation for building the homes in the Brickell Hammock. But the big pavilion is where they would sell the lots. Some of the lots were selling at one point in early 1925 for as low as $4,000, with the caveat, if you don't buy it now, it's going to be up to $8,000 within a matter of a month or two. And that's just the way things were going during that peak year, the great real estate boom of the mid-1920s. So you've got this kind of picturesque thing at today's 2nd Avenue and 25th Road, large tent, lots of buyers. This is very typical of a lot of land developments in Miami during that peak year of 1925 with the boom. In terms of the Brickell Estates, we have renderings of 12th Avenue, which was referred to as a boulevard, being 80 feet in width, and 27th Road, which is a beautiful street. It comes right out of St. Peter and Paul as it's moving in an easterly direction, being 75 feet. And those renderings indicate that on 27th Road, you're going to have these beautiful, large, usually two-story Mediterranean-style homes. That did not materialize. Instead, you've got primarily in that area immediate pre-World War II homes and immediate post-World War II homes. The boom collapsed in 26, and a lot of the ideas, at least for the buildings, did not get off the drawing board until much later than that time. Coral Way. Mary Brickell had envisioned a grand street that would run through this Rhodes neighborhood and in some ways link up these subdivisions, although she was gone by the time it materialized, to be called Coral Way or 3rd Avenue or 13th Street or 22nd Street. Take your pick, it's very confusing. It would be 125 feet across. And there'd be some retail and some institutions on the street. Otherwise, this is almost all a residential neighborhood. And as time went on, that would happen. Now, when all of this began to really materialize was with the post-World War II explosion. Whereas so much of the rest of the city, the county, the nation were moving into the new suburbs, the Rhodes neighborhood as a center city neighborhood was being built up very dramatically and quickly. The homes were relatively simple at that time. It was still a pricey place because of the land they sat on. People liked the idea of an in-town neighborhood with wide roads, not many apartments, an easy place to get around and connected to so many other places. So you begin to see really, I think, a post-World War II explosion, and Coral Way begins to come into its own. By the 60s, 70s, and thereafter, apartment complexes are gracing Coral Way. There's a little bit of a retail area toward what would be the eastern flank of Coral Way. There's a beauty parlor and a few restaurants and what have you. But what's really fascinating about Coral Way was the proliferation of institutions that appeared after World War II. For example, Beth David opened as the largest synagogue in Florida in 1949. So its original location there, that is 26th Road in Coral Way. St. Sophia, Greek Orthodox Church, very large, important church, opened on 24th Road in Coral Way in the late 1940s. The Syrian Lebanese Club opened directly across the street in 1950 from Beth David. Saints Peter and Paul, which was on the other edge of the road, that is the north side, had already opened, a Roman Catholic church, in 1939. There was a church that predates all of these in that neighborhood, and that was the Holloman Park Methodist Church. The building's still there. The expressway took off a portion of it. You've got development going on all around it as we speak. It's kind of in disarray. It was a grandiose church, and it was on property donated by Mary Brickell in 1921, just again a few months before she died, for a church. In fact, one of her sons, William Brickell, was buried out of that church several years after it opened. Now, other things to note would be the demographic composition of the Rhodes neighborhood. After World War II, in part because of these institutions I just named, you had a fairly large Syrian Lebanese population. You had a large Greek population. You had a large Jewish population. You had a large Italian population. So it was very multi-ethnic long before we began to really think about that in terms of Miami. Green spaces, not nearly enough, but you have the preeminent example of a subtropical hammock in Simpson Park, which is about 10 acres, graced by South Miami Avenue on the east side, and on the north side you'd have Southeast 15th Road, which was known initially as Broadway, and it's been recently co-named Broadway. And then it stretches over to about, somewhere around 19th Road. So it does take up a lot of land. Beautiful park. Transportation systems, I wanted to bring this up. Transportation has impacted in many ways the Rhodes neighborhood. The Florida East Coast Railway crossed the river in 1901, and they ran right through what would be the eastern edges of the Rhodes neighborhood. In fact, that's where Metro Rail began running in 1984 along that right-of-way. But you also had the expressway that really separated just a tiny portion of the area around South Miami Avenue, east of most of the roads, from other parts of the roads. And they began to build that through there in the early 1960s. It was completed in that area by the mid-1960s. But the thing that's really interesting is George Merrick's interurban, a trolley system, if you will, running from today's Miracle Mile in Ponce all the way down Coral Way, came right down the center of Coral Way over down South Miami Avenue into downtown Miami. And that rail ran between 1925 and the mid-1930s. Railroads shut down at that time during the Great Depression. The tracks were uprooted, and those great ficus trees then were planted in the center of that area, which has given it so much cachet, I think. So a final thing I wanted to mention before we go to Q&A is the fact, or two final things. The Rhodes neighborhood is an anomaly. It's one of the few center city neighborhoods I know of anywhere in America whose value only rose in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Today, it's astronomically priced. Instead of, like so many center cities, being bedeviled by the movement of so many people out to suburbia, the Rhodes continue to thrive during all this time. And during these last two booms of the first part of this century, prices have skyrocketed. I don't know what the average price is, the median price is, but we're talking at least in the $700,000 range, and a lot more than that for a lot of places. What a lot of people have done is they bought some of these simpler buildings that were built either in 1939 or 40 or in 47 or 52. They've either knocked them down or added huge units to them because they consider the neighborhood and location to be so valuable. The Rhodes has also been the neighborhood for many prominent residents, and I just wanted to offer this to you, and then we can go to Q&A, and I do have a couple of bibliographic suggestions for you regarding the Rhodes. Hugh Wilson, who was a tremendous TV and movie writer, WKRP in Cincinnati, Police Academy, Rustler's Rhapsody, Tony Randall's show, it just goes on and on and on. He lived in the Rhodes. Or Judge John Gramling, a prominent judge of his day. The August family of August Brothers Bakery fame. Former president of Cuba, Prio Socarras, lived in the Rhodes. Had a beautiful home, in fact, on South Miami Avenue. Anne Mergen, arguably the first woman editorial cartoonist in the United States, lived in the Holloman Park section of the Rhodes. Ernie Seiler, the mad genius behind the Orange Bowl parades and the Orange Bowl halftime shows, lived in the Rhodes. Father Mekris, the great leader of St. Sophia, and a man who also birthed a lot of other Greek Orthodox, first of all, missions that became full-fledged churches over time. Mitchell Sergani ran the concessions at Miami National Airport for a long period of time. Cesar LaMonica, who offered free concerts for a period of 50-plus years in Bayfront Park. Abe Aronovitz, the first and only Jewish mayor of the city of Miami, lived in the Rhodes. Eddie Alvarez, an Olympic skating champion, Rhodes. Dr. Eduardo Padron, my old boss at Miami-Dade College, has been a resident of the Rhodes for decades. Virgil Fernandez, fire chief of Miami Beach, earlier Hollywood. Chris Corge, a major political force in the Democratic Party nationally as well as locally. Our own wonderful Dr. Michael Rosenberg, who headed History of Miami at one point, grew up in the Rhodes. Juanita Green, who was a great environmentalist and herald writer, lived in the Rhodes, passed away just a few years ago in her mid-90s. And the great-grandchild of Isabella and Charles Peacock are among some of the folks who lived in the Rhodes neighborhood. So it's been such an interesting neighborhood over time, so ethnically oriented, so much, of course, around houses of worship or social institutions of different nationalities that have drawn people to it. In terms of bibliography, we at History of Miami published an article of mine in South Florida History Magazine on the Rhodes neighborhood. It came out in the 2005 first number of that magazine. I believe we published either 2 or 3 numbers that year. And then another article I've written on the Rhodes in a magazine called In and Around the Rhodes appeared in the October 2017 issue of that magazine. But in the little bit of time we have left, I would love to take any questions anyone might have. I'm just kind of scrolling down here. Okay. Let's see now. Simpson Park is gorgeous. Yes, indeed it is. And named for Dr. Charles Torrey Simpson, who actually lived next, this is ironic, next to Legion Park in northeast Miami. But he was such a force here for environmentalism, they named the park for him. Prior to that, it was Jungle Park. Incidentally, they wanted to take out a portion of that park and run the expressway through it. And History of Miami was among the forces back in the late 50s that, of course, fought to maintain the park the way it was. Let's see now. Something South Florida Clothiers has talked about. An honor it was to work with Arva Parks and the Miami-Dade County Library Advisory Board. That's Christine. Hi, Christine. How you doing? Arva was involved in so many things. You know, her whole thing about Miami is to give people a sense of place. For those who love Miami and love its history, she succeeded wildly in that. Let's see. Where is Dr. George's polo from? It's actually from South Florida Clothiers, and that is a stone crab on it. Just asking for a friend, says Marlene. Ken, thanks for watching. Okay, just looking for any questions anybody might have. Greenies from Hollywood, that's good. Steve, how you doing? Jill, thank you. Here's hello from Madrid. That's great. Casey Paquette says we missed the chirping birds. Yeah, we covered them downstairs, and I moved to a room just above them. We can't hear them. They are beloved. Hi, Bernie. Okay, and Stuart out in Monterey. How you doing out there? Good to have you joining us. Here's Carly Carrillo. Hi, I live in the Roads, house built in 1921. Would I be able to find what the original house looked like? It would be a challenge. The first thing we can do is just go to city directories to get an idea of who's lived in there over time. We can go to Sanborn maps to see the configuration, perhaps, of the house. We can go to plat books to see also sort of a generic configuration. The city may or may not have. They do have photos of many of the homes. No guarantee of that. It'd be great if they did, though. Where did Janet Reno live? She actually lived out in Kendall. And at least she grew up out in Kendall, but I don't think she ever lived in the Roads itself. Here's Andrew. Have some of the old homes there have chimneys? Yes, they did, especially the homes in Holloman Park had chimneys. That was something that came with those homes. And a lot of people, believe it or not, I'd say up into the 1950s in the greater Miami area, used their chimneys or used their fireplaces for the infrequent times when Miami had really cold weather, which wasn't very often. So Wolfgang asked, where's the Roads? Well, again, it's just about in the heart of the city of Miami, but south of downtown. This lesson will be up later on our archives. Well, I tell you what, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and to please join us again. Hi, Matt. Please join us again for another one of these Miami history discussions. This Wednesday, 3 o'clock, we're going to look at some of the communities in Northeast Dade like Bal Harbor and Bay Harbor and Surfside, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you're really going to enjoy Indian Creek. I think you'll really enjoy that. Other than that, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I really look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday again, okay? And I'm glad we could do this, and I'm glad we could pay homage to Arva Parks, who did so much for Miami history. Thanks again. Have a good day. Thank you.